Stephen Anderson, and I'm doing a student presentation on student retention. So a little bit of background, as I entered into higher education, I started noticing a lot of students that were struggling academically and socially. And those same students that I noticed that were struggling didn't return to the next year, which kind of made me feel like, why aren't these kids being retained every year? So one thing I want to do is kind of look into the issue of student retention so that I can really get more information to kind of help the students that I service. And one thing I noticed was that 20,000, as of 2019, 20 million students enter college, but a third of those students do not return. So how can we look at this issue of student retention and how it can affect colleges and universities across the US? So when I came up with the research question was, when looking at the situation with student retention, there's one thing that needs to be explored. So what are some ways that we can increase student retention? So it's important to kind of dig a little deeper into the situation as well, because we look at it from a standpoint of students not coming and they're not being retained, but it can also impact, especially small universities and colleges at a financial rate, because it says right here, the Department of Education in 2008 placed 114 colleges and universities on a watch list due to their financial failures. Because of their responsibility, they were managing things bad, their retention wasn't well. So we want to kind of see how can this influence also student retention. So looking at the literature, student retention is a field that's been explored many times over. But the one thing that I've noticed throughout my research is that Vincent Tinto's name came up so much. It's like he's like the groundbreaker when it comes to student retention. And the one thing he talked about was addressing two systems. So one was the academic system, which addresses the student's personal commitment to their personal academic goals. These goals consist of an expectation to seek higher grades, willingness to find academic resources when they're struggling, and their expectations for graduation. In the social systems, it addressed the way that the students integrate into the campus. So such as things as joining sports or clubs, attending sporting events, developing relationships with their peers and the faculty, civic engagement, building relationships with community members, businesses, etc. So those are things that he addressed when it came to the academic and the social systems. So he said that if the college can address these systems, then the students will have a better chance of being retained, which means this will increase your student retention rates. There are also other researchers who came along to give their word about student retention, and it kind of built on what Tinto was saying. So one thing that Escobedo looked at was a 3-year study that talked about a student retention specialist. So some of the things that it deals with that is that it's addressing the academic, the social, and the institutional needs of the students. So some of the things that they did within this job was to discuss the success of students, receive feedback from faculty on student progression. So they're going to this faculty and they're actually having conversations about these students that they are supposedly watching over. And they plan appointments. But the most important part is that they're making weekly or daily contact with these students to make sure that they're also addressing their needs. Talbert looked at it from the standpoint of using faculty members and advisors, and academic advisors. And they created this thing, plan of action, which was to increase enrollment, retention, and graduation rates, which they called ERG rates. So it came to 3 different phases, and the phases were to create an ERG plan of action that consists with schools' mission to give directives in increasing and enhancing ERG rates. That kind of speaks for itself. So when the next one was developing community and academic partnerships that help to serve the needs of the students. So when we think about developing partnerships, we think about being active in our community. So think of things such as developing a partnership with a local company and creating a pipeline for internships and possibly jobs in the future. Build relationships between student and community. It also increases cultural awareness. Development of academic advisement, mentoring programs to help guide incoming freshmen and transfer students. So one thing to think about is the ability to have mentoring, because just to have that big brother, big sister is always watching over you to make sure you're okay when it comes to time management, classes, social events such as getting integrated on campus. And another thing that was very helpful was the TRIO program, such as Student Support Services and the Ronald B. McNair Post-Baccalaureate Achievement Program. Those are programs that really help to get students more involved and start to develop a more well-rounded student as well too. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Addressing student retention through ethnicity is another way of looking at how to address student retention. So for African Americans, there were 4 important factors to deal with. So pre-entry attributes, such as like ACT tests and things like that. Goals and commitments, are they going to be committed to their academics? Institutional experiences, are there things that are culturally there for them? And personal and narrative integration. How can they integrate into campus in order for them to be comfortable and stay there year after year? With Hispanics and Latino, there was another 4 factors. Those factors were personal reasons, environmental reasons, campus and institutional involvement, such as what is there on campus that can keep them there, and social, cultural factors. What things are on campus when it comes to cultural diversity that helps them to stay there? So the method that I have to deal with, I'm sorry for the misspelling, is the meta-analysis was used to do this research. Unfortunately, I'm not in a classroom at this time, so I could not do action research, but I was able to do a meta-analysis, which is a technique that's used to review research literature on the particular subject. And in this case, it was student retention. And we want to look at these articles to find ways to increase it. So it helps to find qualitative research that can be compared to the works of others in hopes of finding similarities or differences or create a relationship between the articles and finding ways to increase student retention. So the way to do this meta-analysis has to be conducted in 4 ways. The first step is to define the purpose of the research. So our purpose is to find ways to increase student research. The second step, it deals with finding sample selection that applies specific procedures for locating these studies and meeting the criteria for inclusion. So in this case, because I don't have students within the classroom, I had to use the research. So the research I was going for was for 4-year public and private institutions and what is being researched when it comes to student retention. So one thing I did was I found main articles using student retention using multiple journal databases such as ERIC, ProQuest Central, things, Google Scholar, things of that nature. And then also doing the same thing when I found supporting articles on student retention. The third step is to collect this data. So now you're taking this data, you're finding all the multiple ways of how to increase student retention. And so then you're doing is you're trying to find that relationship once you examine and analyze the data, and you want to find the relationships between the main articles to support the research in increasing student retention. So the last step is that student statistical procedures investigate the relationships among study characteristics and their findings. So the findings that we found was that the relationships with the articles in the research was that through academic, social, and financial systems, you can increase student retention. So the results, when analyzing the main articles, it shows that financial, academic, and social systems were the main relationships between the articles in increasing student retention rates. So I'm going to show you a list of those results. So starting with financial systems, we talk about the amount of aid. So when we talk about the amount of aid, we're talking about the amount of financial aid that's given to a student. Okay, we talked about merit-based aid. So if a student comes in and they have very good grades, high GPA, they've had some student achievement going on campus, they can also have some merit-based aid that can help them to stay there financially. Pell Grant is another thing, and it's usually the less your parents make, the more Pell Grant you can possibly get. Tuition costs. If the cost of tuition is low, students are more apt to stay there because now they have a little bit more financial stability because it's not as expensive as another school. And faculty salaries. So in the article talked about using more part-time versus full-time when it came to studies of like medicines and things of that nature in business. It kind of kept away to keep money by not spending money on insurance and some benefits and things like that. It just paid with jobs, but a lot of those part-time faculty members, they were able to work at different universities as well. Academic systems deals with the teacher-student ratio, so however many students it is per teacher. Tutoring and mentoring services, those are academic resources that students need, especially incoming freshmen, when they come on campus because they need to know the academic rigor that, occurs on the college campus. Learning communities like cohorts, supplemental instruction to help those that kind of are a little bit falling behind, but we can kind of help boost them up. And advising. Advising is so important because if we give them the correct classes, then those students will be successful. The next result is talking about the social system. So one thing I found was the availability of student services. So the student services that was mentioned within the research were the TRIO programs. So these are programs that are for low income, first generation disabilities, or those who are represented in unrepresented populations. So you have student support services and you have the Ronald McNair program. So what are the ways to increase student retention rates? So we have to address the financial, the academic, and the social systems in order for those colleges to be successful. Also, it's a way for them to use or invest the financial revenue that they may get from the increase in student retention in order for them to improve certain conditions. So my conclusion is when addressing financial and academic and social systems, there are multiple ways to increase student retention rates. And colleges and universities can address these new ways when they are in a better financial position. And some of the recommendations was that students and student retention is a situation that's ever evolving. So what we want to do is we want to be able to continue the research and by addressing the financial, addressing the academic, and addressing the social systems so that we can find different ways to address certain situations. I can give you an example, which is when Ohio State, what they did was they built a diversity system, a diversity building that helped African Americans, and by providing more resources, by providing more access to resources so that the students can be more successful while on campus. The engineering program as well helped to get more resources by adding more professors so they have more ways to access professors if they need help after hours. They also had new labs for engineering labs. They built new labs for the African American students to be able to, and the students on campus to be able to have high technology stuff to use versus using old equipment. And these are the references that I use with this information. And this is the end of my project for student retention. Thank you.